So in this last session now, the idea would be to loop back to things that we didn't get a chance to talk enough about if we wanted to. I'm going to be stepping away, and Joe has got the host, and so he'll be moderating any discussion. And so just really a free-flowing opportunity to create a, whatever queue you want, bring up whatever conversations you want, and people can trickle off as they want to. But maybe let's start off by a couple of nice comments about Joe, and then we'll talk about philosophy again. So anybody want to say something nice about Joe?
Yeah.
Really?
All right, so philosophy talk. What do you want to talk about? Anybody want Ronnie to put up his last slide and let me leave the room so you can actually get to the juiciest part of his talk? Does anybody want that?
Actually, that's a very good idea.
I vote for that too.
Yeah.
All right, Ronnie, we got it. You got an encore request. Thanks, everybody.
What we get out of this project. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Got it.
Are you still muted, maybe, Ronnie?
No, Ronnie, you're
Am I now unmuted?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, the example I wanted to give is the following. You know that Whitehead in Science and the Modern World gives also a discussion of quantum theory, the old quantum theory. But he does that in a popular way, which can lead to misunderstanding. Now, H.L. learns that when he talks in Science in the Modern World of vibratory organic deformations, what he actually did was look at stationary waves of charge density. And when he talks in Science in the Modern World about vibratory locomotions, he's actually talking about traveling electromagnetic waves. So both types of vibration involve the continuity of waves. The vibratory organic deformations are, in fact, Whitehead's electronic and protonic primates. They originally involve atomic character imposed upon a continuous field. The theory of primates was developed prior to HL1's change from continuous to atomic becoming. In HL2, however, the quantum of action, atomicity, is more fundamental than the primates. Vibratory locomotions I'll go back. Vibratory locomotions are electromagnetic waves, light waves. Now, contrary to his theory of relativity, Whitehead's alternative for the old quantum theory was soon out of date. The evolution of physics showed that it was not really a viable theory. For instance, protons were not elementary particles, electrons are fermions, the photon was seen as the carrier of the electromagnetic force, so boson. And what I want to show now is a quote that I got from a highly recommendable book, Physics and the World Soul by Matt, who is present, so he can definitely react. And this is an interpretation by Matt prior to the publication of HL1. So he did not have the advantage of seeing what these types of vibration actually meant to Whitehead in terms of physics. And he says in Whitehead's organic terms, fermions and bosons can be described according to the two types of vibration, vibratory locomotion and vibratory organic deformation, respectively. Vibratory locomotion describes the particle-like aspect. It is the discontinuous epochal realization of fermion primates. As you've just seen, this is not at all the case. It is, to start with, there is no epochal realization in his theory of primates. And the vibratory locomotion describes electromagnetic waves or light, which are in fact photons, so bosons. And then Matt continues, while vibratory organic deformation describes the wave-like aspect, the continuous transition of reiterated pattern of boson primates. You see, it's just the other way around. And I'm not saying this to discredit Matt in any way. His book is fantastic, but you see the value of the publication of the Harvard lectures showing how this actually a 2013 extrapolation, so way before the publication of HL1, is at variance with what Whitehead actually taught, and how it can be brought in line with Whitehead's speculations in a next edition of that marvelous book. That's the example I wanted to give of a good Whitehead scholar, someone who I admire, and yet there is this difficulty of interpreting what Whitehead writes on quantum mechanics in Science and the Modern World.
Fantastic. I don't know if you have any reaction, Matt.
Yeah, I'm grateful, Ronnie, for you pointing this out. It's one of the couple of sentences in that book that I was most nervous about. I was searching, and I realized because of what you've pointed out here that I was searching for something in Science in the Modern World that wasn't there yet, in a sense, or at least Whitehead wasn't thinking in an epical way in that theory of primates. And so that book's been through so many editions. I don't know if I can do another edition at this point, but perhaps mentioning it. Getting this point out there so that people don't get the wrong impression by reading my book. So thanks for that.
George?
Yes, thank you. I'm still not sure we have that right. I'm trying to remember what was on the slide, but I think the vibratory organic deformation was essentially the description of the Bohr atom, or the Bohr vision of quantum mechanics, where you would have the wave lengths of, you could actually draw them geometrically in a diagram and show how, depending on the wavelength, the energy of the electron, a certain number of finite waves would fit together in a radius. That was the physical idea of the electron spinning around. And the point was to quantize those, that there could only be a finite number of states. You couldn't just continuously increase the energy, say, of the electron. You would have to increase it to the next orbit, as it were, or energy level, where the wavelengths would still fit in their entirety without any loss or omission of a waveform. Whereas the locomotion was Whitehead and his pointing vector from Maxwell. That is how, in a field, energy is transmitted. That's a different kind of thing altogether. So it still seems to me there's room for argument about. Certainly that whole set of conceptions was replaced in the post-Copenhagen interpretation, with the fermions, the bosons, and ideas of spin 1/2 and um, exclusion of, of particles of a given energy state from inhabiting the same state. A whole lot of differences went into quantum mechanics right after Whitehead published Science in the Modern World. But I still think he was, in terms of the old theory, trying to develop a more generalized conception of the Bohr vision of of energy states fitting certain certain energy levels and being excluded from others by virtue of being non-continuous.
I think that he actually takes his distance from Bohr in the sense that in the Bohr model, the old quantum theory, this is still, as you mentioned, about certain orbits, trajectories, and things like that, which is absolutely, again, a recurrence to the fallacy of simple location. And so what Whitehead did was, in his alternative, he tried to obtain exactly the same experimental data on the quantized emission of energy, but without recurrence to the Bohr model. In fact, in HL2, he refers to the paper of a chemist, forgot his name now, I mentioned it in my paper as well, Langmuir, is the chemist, and I've looked up that paper, and in fact, the main thing that Langmuir wants to do is to say, well, we chemists, we don't like the Bohr model, and we have an alternative here. So I don't actually think that he is referring to the Bohr model when he speaks about a vibratory organic deformation. This is vibratory organic deformation, as I said, involves the vibration, let's say, a creation and annihilation of energy, which results in a kind of standing wave, and that is in fact an organic deformation. There is no organic deformation in Bohr's model. There is an organic deformation in Whitehead's alternative to Bohr's model. So, yeah, but yeah, we could go more into detail, and there is always room for discussion. Of course, I'm open to an alternative view.
Thanks.
All right. Well, at this point, thanking Ronnie again for his great contributions. We can sort of move into, if anyone has a question. Oh, actually, I see Matt has his hand raised. Please go ahead, Matt.
I don't know that I can weigh in on what George and Ronnie are discussing here, different interpretations. I have to think more about that. But I had a different question for you, Ronnie, about the future, and your statement about Whitehead's example from Arabian Nights, right, and the definiteness of the future. I think this has some bearing on the question of sort of the status of eternal objects and some of Hartshorne's and Whitehead's disagreements about that, and to what degree is the future definite, and what's the difference between the definiteness of the future and the decisiveness of actualization, let's say. So how do you think through what gets added, say, to that definiteness, the definite possibilities of the future that that makes it real, and how does that conception avoid the kind of determinism that obviously Whitehead wanted to avoid, where the future is sort of already there, you know, sort of like Einstein's view, let's say. Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
But I think that you're in order to be actual, there has to be decision. But the decisions are not yet taken by future events. So it's only an anticipation of the future that is at play. But that anticipation already is something for an actual occasion in the present, is already something definite. But of course, the future is not actual. It's not a block universe. The decisions are there to take in the future. It's not, we can long for something, we can project something, we can make plans for something, but it's the actual occasions of the future by their decisions that will make the future actual. So I don't know whether I've answered your question.
What about something like precognition or a kind of clairvoyance that, you know, a lot of people who want to bring Whitehead into dialogue with parapsychology and so on, they say, oh, well, he doesn't leave room for that. But then there is this definiteness of the future, but it hasn't yet been solidified, as it were. How do you think that issue through?
I didn't. I've not through. But yeah, what there is this author I really like. It's a Belgian French author, Marguerite Yourcenar, and she wrote somewhere that it's not impossible to hear in the womb of time what will happen in the future. I think that the way that I see it is insufficient for definite precognition of the future, but not for anticipatory feelings of the future. Some people really are more apt to feel in the present what the future is going to be like. But of course, I know this is not a specific event that is forecasted with accuracy. But I don't know about that.
George?
Just a quick note, this reminds me of, I don't know if any of you remember the work that Lewis Ford was doing towards the end of his life, but he had a theory of God being the actuality of the future. And that's what enabled the present occasion in the present to apprehend some aspect of the future as an ingredient in present concrescence. I could frankly never understand the theory, nor was I convinced by it. I raised it only because it was because of this discussion that Matt and others have raised. This has come up several times in our presentations for the last two days, what the status of the future is, other than a name for things that are not yet or yet to become, and how they can play a role in determination in the present. Those things what are not yet. And this was Lewis's solution. If anybody, maybe Dan, do you remember this, or anybody else who had those kinds of interests? Dan, were you raising your hand? Dombrowski? No.
Yeah,
There
I mean,
there was one thing I wanted to mention actually, which is not related to any of this really, but Ronnie's original paper proposal was to kind of answer all of the questions on Whitehead's midterm exam, which he didn't end up doing. But I kind of wanted to point that out because Well, for one thing, of course, in trying to pick an order for all of the presentations, and I did try and have some logic to that and have papers in conversation with each other, but I thought, oh, as soon as I saw that, oh, that would be wonderful to end with that one, end with Whitehead's exam, and then we'd all be ready for a big discussion at the end here, especially since Ronnie would have given us all the answers. But I guess I just wanted to point out too that I thought that was a really great idea, and part of it is that I think it's easy to, as you're reading the Harvard lectures, to kind of skip past those exams because you naturally just want, oh, well, okay, here's an exam, but I want to get on to what Whitehead's saying in the next lectures. But actually, if he's taken any care at all, if Whitehead has in putting together those exams, then they are sort of trying to get out a summary of what Whitehead wanted his students to learn from it all. So of course, that's worth looking at. And of course, in retrospect, trying to answer all of those in one paper was too broad because it's basically asking to summarize the entirety of a semester of what Whitehead was trying to teach. But if you had sort of slept on those exams in the Harvard lectures, they're worth taking a look at.
One of the difficulties to do just that is exactly typically Whiteheadian. It's that you start with a question such as the morphological versus the functional view, but you cannot adequately answer that without involving all the other contrasts. And so I wonder if I had followed Whitehead's courses, whether I would be able to just stick to the question he asks without involving everything else that he said. It's so difficult to cut a little part out of the exposition and then give an adequate answer. It's all so intertwined. All these contrasts are really fused, let's say, in Whitehead's work. And it's very difficult to isolate one of them and then give a clear answer. But yeah, that was one of the difficulties. Plus that I was too ambitious as well.
Yes,
I was
indeed.
going to ask about that too, Joe, and to see what happened to the exams. My fear is that in my case, I'm like Bertrand Russell, simple-minded. I would have flunked. They're just too difficult to answer. But do we have any graded exams in our collection? Any that Whitehead himself marked?
Yeah, we don't have any graded exams that we know of. We do have a few graded papers of students. Some of them kept them with Whitehead's comments, although typically he had a teaching assistant like read them first, and he tended to make pretty minimal comments from the few I've seen. But yeah, I don't think we have any graded exams that I know of. We do have several other of the exam itself. Sadly, we don't have anywhere near all of them. I think we probably theoretically, if you did one every term, there should be 26 of them, and I think we have maybe 5. I don't remember exactly how many. But yeah, those are interesting things. And thankfully, I guess, at least from looking at Whitehead's grading notebook, it looks like he was not actually that hard of a grader. So maybe you would have done okay, George.
Might have slipped by.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions that, for instance, they didn't get to ask of some of the other presenters, providing that presenter is still here, if you'd like to raise anything, please feel free. Ben, please.
All right, I guess if nobody else has anything else to say, I'll bug Matt even more to, you brought up this one passage in Process and Reality where Whitehead actually says that he doubts that that's such a thing as really like actual simplicity. That's just kind of this relative thing of how we're analyzing stuff. Which I totally forgotten that he said that. And then I went back to that part in the book and I commented, it's like, how does this relate to sense? So, so now I'm kind of wondering, like, you brought it up, but but I'm not sure like to what extent it. I'd be curious what everybody else also thinks about this. Is there such a thing as like simple eternal objects in any sense? How can we reconcile that with like him kind of doubting that that exists in the sense that Hume was talking about before? Is there kind of another definition of simple eternal object that can make sense with him sort of saying that he doesn't believe in simplicity in that sense in that passage? Be curious about all that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I mean, it's a really vexing issue for me. I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. That comment about simplicity being kind of relative to the type of analysis we're trying to undertake, it comes at the end of a discussion of Hume's treatment of gradation of color. And I couldn't actually see Whitehead ever explicitly in Process and Reality identifying colors with simple sensa. He says that they're more abstract and abstracted from the empirical world, the physical world. But then it's like, I want Whitehead to be a radical empiricist, and so it worries me that he's trying to think through experience using an abstraction that's not actually thinkable, if as it were. So what is the status of simplicity? I don't know. That's where I've gotten after 12,000 words. And I thought color provided a good example to maybe try to think through it, but bringing in Goethe's color theory is only, trying to answer a mystery with another mystery in some sense. So.
I have a question. Just there's a lot of talk about the kind of dipolar dialectics, and just curious if there's been any kind of connection made between the Whiteheadian perspective of those kind of dialectics and the modern neuroscience theories of like either the predictive coding theory or basically predictive theory of neuroscience, which is saying that there's these basic like prediction based upon your a priori, neural network understanding of different forms, and then you have the sense information that's coming in, but that the way that we perceive is in this dialectic of this looking at what our previous models in our brain are looking at versus the sense data. And if there's a difference, then it sends dopamine into the mind. And so it seems like a lot of these deeper discussions around these eternal forms or these structures and the sense data as they're being contrasted with each other is kind of made its way into modern neuroscience, and to what degree are the kind of Whiteheadian perspectives of those things in dialogue with the modern neuroscience of these issues.
There is one Whiteheadian, Jesse Bettinger, who's working on sort of free energy principle and these predictive processing understandings of neuroscience and bringing it into dialogue with Whitehead. I think there's some promise there, but I can't, off the top of my head, go into much more detail there other than I worry that a lot of the predictive processing approach in neuroscience is, like if you look at David Chalmers' new book on Reality Plus, it's called, on the simulation hypothesis and stuff, it starts to get a little Cartesian, as though we're stuck in a representational prison and a virtual reality with no access to the outside world. And I think of Whitehead's quote, some people express themselves as though the brain and the sense organs are the only real things in an entirely imaginary world. Not exact quote, but that's basically what he says. So that would be my only concern about comparing these two approaches.
Yeah, I had a chance to interview Chalmers for my podcast when that book came out. So, and I had a chance to ask him if he's been familiar with the process philosophy at all. And he said that he tried to read it, but couldn't, make heads or tails of it. So he hasn't really dug into the process fully. He said he's been recommended to to read it for a number of times, but he hasn't been able to really crack it.
In that vein, Kent, have you run into Jean Dupre at Exeter?
No.
For that matter. He's another whose work with Chalmers is compatible with a Whiteheadian perspective. And I think, unlike Chalmers, he can read Whitehead and knows full well this is true, but begs people not to make the comparison because it will discredit his work.
Take a look at that. One other thought that came up with the dyads, I know when listening to Tim Eastman's series, he was talking a lot about, you know, kind of getting away from just the dyadic thinking into more of a Peircean triadic way of thinking about the input, output, and context. And so I'm just, you know, as the discussion around triads, I know that there was the James Bradley sort of series of speculative philosophy books that had like these graphics at the end trying to include more of those triadic ways of thinking. But yeah, as the earlier discussions about the dyads were coming up, that's one in terms of that. And then also I'll just give a shout out to Grant Maxwell's book, The Integration and Difference, Constructing a Mythical Dialectic, that is trying to look at these issues of the integration and the contrasts between those two things through 13 different philosophers, including Whitehead. But yeah, just the thought of the Peircean triads as a way of kind of escaping out of some of the more dualistic or dyadic ways of thinking. And that from Eastman, he says you can't have any measurement without that third aspect of the context. And so it's input, output, context is what Eastman says. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Very good. For lovers of James Bradley, by the way, and Schelling for that matter, the Metaphysical Society is going to sponsor a Zoom conference like this on October 7th, this coming month, where Sean McGrath, a very well-known colleague of Brian's and also a Schelling scholar, will be presenting his work on James Bradley, who was a professor for many years at Memorial University prior to his death. And some of this may come up then. I think Eastman will be there, I hope, and hope you can join us. The information's on the MSA website, I believe.
Oh, cool, thanks.
Anyone else have topics they want to raise?
This is Farzad. Here, let me turn my camera on. Hi.
Okay.
Regarding the predictive model, I don't remember Jesse Bettinger's details either, but from what I could remember, there's some ideal free energy that the brain is kind of striving toward. And if we go full up mechanical on this, we're trying to make predictions that are correct or that are not disappointed. And I think that covers a lot of brain activity, but there's something left over. The first time I heard this, my first reaction was with regard to Whitehead's concept of intuition. There's the affirmative, so there's the confirmational. This has been a while since I've thought about this, but confirmational feelings where your prediction is what's the word, confirmed, versus the negative feeling where the opposite happens or it's not confirmed. And so you're looking for yes and no, yes and no, yes and no. And this is what gets you through the world in a survival mode. But then there's the suspended judgment mode. So there's affirmative judgment, negative judgment, and then suspended judgment. And in suspended judgment, you're not playing that game at all, where you're striving towards some ideal or another. And it's kind of like Peirce's concept of abduction, where you are enjoying the suspense, as it were, and not actually going towards something that you have some idea of, which will either be disappointed or rewarded, right? And so I think a lot of a lot of interesting activity, a lot of thinking or conscious activity is that sort of striving toward novelty. That's what that suspended judgment is about. And I don't know how well that is covered at all by these free energy models of cognition or physical models of what the brain is doing at that time. So while it is absolutely useful, I think, to apply those models to the brain's activity, it doesn't tell the whole story, and it actually leaves out some really interesting types of creative thinking, imaginative or imaginal thinking that don't have anything to do with what's actually going to happen or actually not going to happen. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there and remind us that Peirce talked about this stuff at good length and had several names for it besides abduction. There was musing, and I think musing is probably a nice way to think of that way of consciousness. In response to Kent.
Yeah, I was just say that thanks for that, because the predictive coding theory does have a little bit of a dialectical nature of like your predictions versus the experience, and that, yeah, it doesn't have much room for that, suspended judgment mode. So I don't know how much they're able to kind of measure these things, or whether or not, to what degree that's been developed over time, of this kind of like sense input coming in comparison to the previous models. But yeah, I like that kind of escaping the dialectic into the more triadic way of thinking of this kind of musing or suspended judgment. So thanks for that.
May I say something about the simple eternal object?
Sure.
Sorry, I'm quite tired, but maybe because it has always helped me to think about the relationship in between eternal objects and actual entities, thinking about the concept of nature, where Whitehead differentiates events from objects. And of course, object is something that you can recognize, whereas an event is something that has to pass. And that helped me because, I mean, it is also something that is quite traditional. I mean, if you think about the universals or predicates that are the universals, and also consider, let's say, some trivial examples. The sun is yellow. So in that case, yellow should be, the predicate is the universal. And I don't know, as far as I understand why Whitehead says that we can think about a simple eternal object, I think that is thinking about something like that. So eternal objects are something that we can recognize in the events that are changes. And if it is so, I don't know how to say that, but I mean, a simple eternal object, it corresponds to some feeling. I mean, when you said, someone wrote in the chat that, I cannot find, okay. So like, when we we can say, we can perceive something red, but also we can use red as a predicate. So I think that to this extent, we can understand why we can thinking about a simple eternal object. That doesn't mean that eternal objects are not related among each other, but that we can consider just per time one idea, let's say, one potentiality, okay? And we can use this eternal object, this potentiality in isolation in a way, but this potentiality in isolation corresponds to a sense perception in a way. I don't know, maybe it's too confusing, but I don't know.
Yes, Ronnie?
Yeah, I also wanted to add something about simple eternal objects. As from concept of nature, it is clear that, of course, we all know Whitehead takes his distance from the subject-predicate model. So, for instance, a color is not a predicate of the object, is not a predicate of the mind that perceives. But, you know, maybe a color is still a simple mode of relatedness, even though it involves a multi-termed relation. So the conditions, let's say, for the ingression of the color red can be highly complex. It can depend on your mood, on the time of the day, whether you perceive an object as red or not as red. It is a mode of relatedness, and there are so many actual entities, if you want, involved. It's not a predicate of one actual entity, not even of one enduring object. It is something that ingresses because there is a multi-termed relation between many. So the relation can be complex, whereas the mode of relatedness that ingresses can be simple. So maybe it's important to make that distinction as well. I thought personally, but I should reread Process and Reality to see to what extent I've overlooked it there. But when, because of the functionality that he is highlighting in HL2, I found the idea that eternal objects are potential modes of relational functioning. I thought that was so clarifying, and I look forward to reread Process and Reality to see what has been done with that in Process and Reality. I always thought of, some non-actual entity that ingresses, but you know, you still have that, but it's nothing separate. This is clearly highlighted in these lectures. It's completely fused in the functioning of an actual entity. You cannot separate it, but it is because the actual entity is related in potentially almost an infinite way, an infinite number of ways that, my English is not so good. But you know, I think the fact that the functioning involves the realm of potential modes of relatedness is for me one of the things that I will take from these lectures when I reread his published works. That is, I think, very, very helpful to understand the eternal objects. And modes, because, you know, I really like the fact, Matt, that in your paper you sometimes bring in the notion of adjacent possibilities. Now, that's not the notion of Whitehead, but it might be a very interesting thing to understand what Whitehead says about the principle of reversion, because adjacent possibilities are really, as the word says it, adjacent modes of relatedness. And when you talk about this color that you see after looking to, what was it, to green, and then you look at the white surface and you have this kind of red after image, you know, these modes of being related to what you're seeing are probably adjacent, you see. And so that's why I also mentioned in the chat that I will send you a chapter of my PhD on the philosophy of mathematics, not for you to delve into mathematics at all, but because it gives you an idea of what the impact might be of Whitehead's understanding of Grassmann, and for instance, the color manifold of Grassmann. That's not only important to understand what a positional manifold is in universal algebra, it is also very revealing towards things like eternal objects and the realm of eternal objects. And I've quoted some authors that deal with that, so that might be very interesting to you. And it's even the case, as I think that Jude Jones mentions that in her book Intensity. You see, there is this matter of intensity too in the positional manifold that gets extrapolated to his metaphysics. So I think that it might be a really helpful a way to think about a kind of hierarchy, if you want, of eternal objects. But I am inclined to say a hierarchy of potential modes of relational functioning.
Yeah, that's lovely and super helpful, Ronnie. Thank you. What you were saying about the relational functioning of color as an eternal object and how multi-termed it is, it does, and Ben brought this up again. Ben and I are always thinking of the same question at the same time, it seems, but Whitehead talks about subjective eternal objects functioning in the individual concrescence and not necessarily relationally, whereas objective eternal objects must function relationally. And so color still gets, is like we can conceptually prehend color in our imagination, say like Hume's missing shade of blue, that's not publicly pervading the world. And so it still makes color seem kind of ghostly, haunting time, as Whitehead put it.
Yes, well, to come back to the functioning and the colors, I think there is this difference also between the role in perceptual functioning and conceptual functioning. There is a difference there. And you know the phrase, I don't know where I got it, but of Whitehead, that something can start as a smelly feeling and then evolve into the feeling of that smell. And that is exactly what I think is really what is happening when you have this functioning transitioning from perceptual functioning, where the smelliness is like a mode of relatedness to the object, and then conceptually you're starting to analyze. It's even unconscious, but there is an analysis of the perceptual, and then this smell is no longer the smelly feeling, but the feeling of the smell. I can't put it any better. So, of course, that does not help you out with your question on the difference between eternal objects of the subjective and the objective kind. And I think personally that the distinction is maybe, especially in Process and Reality as compared to Adventures of Ideas, maybe it's too strict. It's made too strict in Process and Reality. And that relates, by the way, to the discussion we had with Eklund on the symbols, in the sense that there is always, and maybe it relates to mathematical beauty as well, there is always that feeling aspect prior to the concept even of a pattern. And so mathematics would not be able to deal, I think, with the embodiment of eternal objects of the objective species without transitioning through the perception and the feeling, the subjective feeling. You know, there is this nice example that I mention in some of my publications of the Babu and Kiki names that can be given to two different kinds of shapes. And the one shape is like a really smooth shape, and the other one has this sharp edges, and no matter what language people speak, people always associate Babu with the smooth form and Kiki with the sharp-edged form. And they do that prior to having any knowledge about the pattern that they are actually seeing, or the similarity, let's say it like that, the similarity between the sound Babu and the smooth shape, or the sound Kiki and the sharp-edged shape. They don't analyze that, but they do feel it. They feel this similarity. So there is something about a subjective phase or a perceptual phase in all these mathematical eternal objects as well. These mathematical patterns do not come without any subjective feelings, without in all feelings there is the how of feeling, and there is the subjective form of feeling, and that's a problem sometimes when you make too sharp a distinction between these two species. Then you cannot account for something like the feeling of beauty in mathematics, which is very remarkable for Whitehead, since in what he writes on beauty in Adventure of Ideas is quite the opposite of what you might infer from a too sharp distinction between those species in process and reality. So I think there is an evolution there as well.
Do you think that transition from perceptual feeling to conceptual feeling how is that related to symbolic reference? Isn't that sort of going from a smelly feeling to a feeling of a smell? Is that not a symbolic reference, an active symbolic reference? And how does that relate to then conceptual feeling versus physical feeling? Is there just a simple one-to-one correspondence, or we have something more going on here that he stops talking about?
It's the difficult question of relating the fusion of the two modes of perception with the theory of feelings, isn't it? There has been written a lot about that. Where, if you want, there are seemingly two theories of perception. You can give a Whiteheadian account of perception in terms of causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, and then the mixed mode of symbolic reference, or you can give a whole exposition, as you did and I did in Intuition in Mathematics and Physics, the book I edited. We did that starting from the theory of feelings and not from the theory of perception as in symbolism, its meaning and effect. So it's you're asking a difficult question. I don't have a clear-cut answer, but yeah, let's leave it at that. I don't have a clear-cut answer to your question.
Thank you. I think you would have still passed the test though, because Whitehead would have been looking for the not clear-cut answer in his midterms.
Does anyone else have any final thoughts? I think we're about ready to wrap things up then. Yeah, Ben.
So if we have enough time to talk more about the subject predicate form of thought thing, I might have some more to say, but we want to just wrap it up. Fine with that as well. I don't know if it's going to open up a whole huge more discussion, but because it got brought up, I'm kind of curious to hear some other people's thoughts about it, on what it means that Whitehead is trying to go beyond the subject predicate form of thought and what he means by that. Because in Process and Reality, I mean, when he talks about propositions, he does still analyze those into like a subject, like the logical subject and a predicate. And I mean, my thought on that was always just that what he's really distinguishing himself from is just that when the predicate is like not a relation, when there's a, or it's a proposition with just like one subject. So you're talking about like one actuality, and you're just predicating a property of that, as opposed to predicating a relation. I'd be curious if people think it's something else, or what the significance there is that people see.
I always thought him and Russell objected to just having, like you say, a predicate of one object as well, instead of a relation among several objects.
I think that you are right that in Process and Reality, he speaks about a predicative pattern. And so I think you're right that that's the difference. It's not a single predicate, it's a predicative pattern. This relates to what I said, that a predicate such as red is a predicate that is requiring, there is a precondition of multi-termed relations. And so you have this predicative pattern with a multiplicity of subjects. It's like he still makes the comparison also in Process and Reality with his propositional functions of Principia Mathematica. In a propositional function as well, you have this propositional function with a lot of variables, and it's so one might say, but that is a predication too. It is a predication, but it's different from a relation between two. There is not a relation of a predicate and a single subject. There is a predication, if you want, of a predicative pattern to a configuration or a society of subjects. I think.
An example might be Chicago's between New York and Los Angeles. I mean,
one of the ways that I guess use a metaphor to help understand what that might mean is, like in Timothy Eastman's book, he talks a lot about the differences between the Boolean and non-Boolean logics, of how there's sort of the kind of the subject predicate kind of gets into a true false Boolean nature, but the realms of possibility and more relational ways of thinking have more of a non-Boolean logic. And that's what Elias Zafiris, as he talks about, like the math forms of the category theory using the sheaf to be able to go beyond the set theory limitations that have that more object-oriented way of thinking into the more of the relational way that, again, back to Eastman, where he talks about the input-output context. So there's more of that triadic relationship where anything that you're having has that sort of additional layer of that context, that's that third axis that in language is called pragmatics, which is actually having the context embedded into it because you know what it means. But there are more contextual languages like indigenous languages or Chinese or other languages that sort of require you to sort of understand the larger contextual relationships that are, and that's separate than, say, more of the subject predicate languages. So that's at least some of the entry points of how I have to start to understand that. I do a lot of coverage of virtual reality, which is a lot of kind of immersing you into a space that allows you to understand the more contextual relationships of that space that go beyond what language can just describe. So I think there's a lot of ways that we get trapped into a certain metaphysical assumptions of substance metaphysics, and that the more process relational metaphysics kind of relies upon other metaphors to understand those more contextual relational dynamics that our language is kind of trapping us in.
Well, I think with that, we'll call it a day. We had scheduled, we're about 2 minutes from our scheduled end of the conference. So just in closing, I'll say, I mean, this was if you've read the introduction, you know that this was a difficult and time-consuming book to edit. In some senses, it took 15 years, if you count just from beginning to gather the materials from all the different archives in order to find all the materials. From when we first started transcribing, it would be about 5 or 6 years. And then from when we actually started to intensively edit, probably took about 2 years. There was one point where Brian and I, for about 6 months, I think we're meeting every Friday for hours on end, partly just to look at these handwritten transcriptions and go, all right, what is that word that we can't quite read? And so for me, it was, especially as an editor of this volume, extremely satisfying to see what everyone has done with it, because in some sense you could say that the fruits of our labors were the book itself, but in another sense this is supposed to be a new Whitehead source book going forward, and so the real fruits are what people are able to do with it. And I've been really impressed by all the papers that were given at this conference the past 2 days, and so I just really want to thank everyone for contributing, and this was great fun and great discussion, and we will certainly be in contact over the next few days, hopefully soon, on next steps in terms of hopefully getting a lot of this stuff published. So thank you to everyone. It was a wonderful time.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Thank you.
The great conference. Bye.
Thanks.